Jamen, kære gæster her til Copenhagen Comics 2025. Tak fordi I er kommet, og tak fordi I er blevet til slutningen. Jeg tror ikke, aftens hovednavn, Don Rosa, fortæller den store introduktion. I'll do it in English, don't worry. I'll do it for English right now. We have on the stage Don Rosa. This is the man, he's here. And you see, despite his age, he was much faster on the stage than any of us, even me and Leila, so I will not compete with him. We got Leila here, and Leila is the head of the Dansk Donaldisforening, which I don't think they need a further introduction. And Leila will do the interview with Don, and there will be some opportunities to ask some questions later in the session. We expect to end about 4:45-ish, depending on the question. So, Leila, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I know you have been at work all day, but I hope you are fresh to answer some questions.
And I can answer questions, yes.
Perfectly.
I don't make speeches, but I can answer questions.
That makes it easy for me then.
All right.
Perfect. Well, the first question is, I know that you actually don't like to draw. So why did you start doing that?
You know, as a child, that's a form of entertainment. I loved comic books. Even more, I loved old movies I'd see on TV. I actually thought the things I was drawing on the business ledgers my father would bring me home from the office, I saw them more as movies. I can't explain it, but I like the movies even more than I like comic books. My sister had lots and lots of comic books, but they weren't all Karl Barks or whoever that guy was who was doing the really good duck comics. But movies I liked in general. But to tell the story, besides writing it, I had to draw it. Well, of course I didn't write it. I made it up as I went along. So, but no, I never enjoyed. Drawing was a way to fill spare time. That's one reason I draw with so much detail. I learned to draw. Well, and some people say my art is a lot like Robert Crumb, or underground artist. And that's because Robert Crumb, when he was growing up, did just like I did. He drew for fun and filled the spare time. So the more detail I'd put in it, the more spare time it would fill up. So I learned to draw as slow as possible, just to entertain myself. Nobody ever saw what I did. But, and I thought comics were all written and drawn by single individuals. I didn't know there was 99% of the time, or 99.9% of the time, it was a writer and an artist. I thought it had to be the same person. So, but the drawing was that was labor. Writing was cerebral. That was mental. So it was the drawing was even when I was doing it supposedly professionally. The drawing wasn't any fun because it was tedious and I didn't think I did it very well. I did it entertainingly, but art directors never liked what I did. But so I guess that's why. That was the only way I had to tell the story to myself.
Yeah. But at some point when you became professional, you must have discovered that there are sometimes a writer and then a comic artist. So why did you just do manuscripts instead then when you found out?
Just because I knew, because I was a comics fan, not just a duck fan. I was a fan of all American comics, Karl Barks' ducks in particular. But I knew, especially as a collector, that all the greatest comics were done by people who both wrote and drew them. Karl Barks, Walt Kelly, Will Eisner, I could go on and on. Some of you probably know the people I'm talking about, Bernie Hogarth. Like I say that the way I draw, I know is, I see it as fan art. You see, when I turned professional, I always thought I was just a fan artist who got paid. But I knew that all of the best comics were done by people who both wrote and drew them. So I didn't think I drew that well on a professional basis, and I knew my stories get sort of a little overly complicated and based too much on fact. But the fact that I both wrote and drew what I did, I felt rather godlike compared to all the people that simply wrote it or simply drew it. So I sort of enjoyed that. It was very slow. That's why I could never make any money at it. But I always want to point out Egmont paid excellently, but only for people who had learned and trained themselves to work swiftly and efficiently with the fewest possible details to still tell the story. And I only learned how to do it with the most possible details to tell 4 or 5 stories at once.
So no money really for you.
No, I was too slow.
Yeah. But since the story is the main thing for you, is there a plot line that you are particularly fond of your own? Is there something in your plot lines you like the best?
Once more, is there...
Which story plot line?
Oh,
do you like the best of your own
story?
Yeah. Do you are there any of them where you think, oh, here is a real something genius?
Well, people ask me this all the time. What's your favorite story? And I say, well, generally, the Scrooge stories, it would have to have something to do with Glittering Goldie or The Life of Scrooge or the Yukon.
Yeah.
All right, I also enjoyed the ones where I teamed Scrooge McDuck up with Teddy Roosevelt, one of our greatest presidents and a personal hero of mine, and a Republican. It defies logic.
He's a Republican from the old days,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
But specifically, the last story I did, I don't know what it was, well, you probably know what it was called, and my title was The Prisoner of White Agony Creek, which was about the character Glittering Goldie and Scrooge McDuck, and according to the Barks story where he introduced Glittering Goldie, and he kidnapped Glittering Goldie for a month to his property or his claim on White Agony Creek. I realized I could tell. I never wanted to do a new story about Goldie and Scrooge interacting, because that was Barks did those, and I didn't want to. I'd do stories where they saw each other from across the street. But then I realized I could do the story of the month on White Agony Creek. And that was in 2007, and then I had lots of reasons to quit at that point. This Disney comic system it just about totally destroyed my interest in telling stories. But I did that one story, The Prisoner of White Agony Creek, and I liked it so much that I knew I'd never create another story that I'd like more, so I quit. There were other reasons, but that was a big reason. I knew I'd hit the top of my farm, and I figured I have to quit sometime, so I might as well quit then. And then I was having eye trouble, and like I say, I never had the passion to tell stories anymore at that point. They'd taken it out of me, the system. So at that point, I decided it was time to quit, and I trademarked my name. Because one of the main reasons I quit was that I never had any control over what editors and colorists and translators did to my work, which really annoyed me, because I put every ounce of my effort and love into that. So I trademarked my name so they could never again use my stories, because they belong to Disney. Disney, which never had any input or contribution to it, but it belonged to them. But I wanted to have control over how the work was presented, as far as the coloring and the lettering and the sound effects and just everything. So from then on, the publishers, if they wanted to use my name on the cover or anywhere in promotional, they had to deal with me, and they had to have it colored and lettered and et cetera, exactly the way I wanted it, or they couldn't use my name. And if they didn't care to use my name, I wouldn't care how they screwed it up. I just didn't want it screwed up with my name on it, because I learned that everybody seems to think that if a comic or even a book is published, it's being done according to the writer and the artist. They have some input into it, but no, it's not true. The editors, especially the Egmont in those days, and it's a different company now, but in those days they just treated the stuff just like they grew on a tree, and they just treated the writers, the translators would treat the story as if it was theirs, and if they just didn't understand the original or they just wanted to add their own jokes, they do that. And the colorists wouldn't want to bother to read the story to know what color something was supposed to be, and they would never. I'd put coloring instructions on the original art, but as soon as I sent that to Egmont, there'd be somebody, a minor functionary in some office. His job was to white out any writing that I put on the art, and then they wouldn't have any I would lots of times put background. A lot of people notice I put background things going on, and characters in the background might be a question mark or a Z showing her asleep or something like that. But that wasn't in the script. That was just one of the private jokes I'd put in there while I was drawing. And that fellow whose job it was to white out any writing that I'd put on the coloring directions or sound effect directions, they'd white all those out, and he'd white out all the things I'd put in the little balloons. And then the letterer would come around and he'd say, well, this isn't in the script. So he'd say, well, I don't know, a little balloon, I'll put a Z in it. And of course I had an exclamation point in it.
Yeah.
So or the other way around. There'd be somebody who'd be obviously sleeping and have a big exclamation point over his head. Because these letterers, they don't really care. In those days, they didn't care what they were doing. They were just trying to get paid. Anyway, so I'd make sure it was exactly the way I wanted it. And then of course, I'd say, and make me an offer for the use of my name. And I'd take whatever they'd offer. Because I know they have to pay the Disney Corporation 7%, 8%, 9%. And Disney doesn't deserve any of it. Disney has no input into it. So I'd get maybe 1%, 2% if I was lucky, and that was fine. That's what I get on any of the new books. That's all right. But because I know there's nothing left, and I also knew I was never going to get rich off doing this anyway. I just would live my childhood dream, and I figured that was enough. What was the question? That's how I give. I say I never give talks. People say, we'd like you to give a speech. I say, I don't give speeches, but I'll answer questions.
And you're very good at it.
Well, and then I'll start. Somebody will ask a question, I'll start answering, and after a while I say, okay, that's enough.
Well, you're making my job very easy, I must admit that.
Okay.
But we can try with another question then.
All right.
Which story, besides The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, have you had the most response to by readers?
Oh, let's see. These are good questions, not asked very often. That Black Knight character I created seemed to be really popular, and I didn't want to. I sort of knew not to create new characters because they wouldn't be my property, but I had to create the character because I wanted to reuse a story that I did in the fanzines back in the 70s. You know, just free work I did for fanzines as a hobby. And I wanted to do the Universal Solvent story. And another story about, anyway, it involved a guy with a suit of armor that had the Universal Solvent on it, so he could, and that was popular, if that's what the sort of thing you mean. It seems like so many, let's see, in Norway, I know I'm not in Norway now, but in the last week I was there, it seemed like at least 15, 20 people said their favorite story was one that I did called The Treasure of the 10 Avatars. But I couldn't figure out why Norwegians particularly like that story. So it all depends on different people like different stories. Some of the people say they like this particular 10-page gag story, and I think, man, I thought that was awful. Well, The Life of Scrooge. They gave me that job, Egmont gave me that job, and I knew I wanted to tell the story of Karl Marx's Scrooge McDuck and bypass all of the other extraneous stories about Scrooge's past that other writers had done over the decades. And that's the only reason it appealed to me. I wanted to just solidify all of the Marxian facts into one narrative so nobody could go off in strange tangents again. But I knew it was going to be boring because it was like a personal fanboy project. And I had 15 pages to tell whole decades-long events in his life. And I knew nobody'd like that except some Parks fans. But even Americans who had never won an Eisner Award, the Americans who didn't even remember these comics ever existed because they stopped being published in America 50 years ago. They tried reading it just because it won an Eisner Award, and people liked it. So it just takes getting somebody's attention, I guess.
It is.
But I never know what, every story I did, I remember one person would say it was the greatest story I'd ever created, or anybody'd ever created, and somebody else would say it was the worst story anybody'd ever, and everybody else would be spread in between. So I learned early on to just trust my own judgment and just tell stories that I wanted to tell, because nobody's going to like everything, and nobody's going to dislike everything. So I always just told stories to suit myself. I figured that was the smartest way to go.
Exactly. In another line of question, you have traveled the world as a huge comic guy here in Europe, at least.
And South America.
Yeah. And you have been a member of the comics community long before also.
Oh, yes.
So you have...
Late 60s.
Yeah. So you must have experienced a lot of things, met a lot of interesting people, had a lot of great moments. But can you narrow down maybe just one or few moments that has really made a mark on you? What is your fondest memory?
Well, that's the reason I do these. It's not the people I've met, and I've met going to comic conventions, even in America. Well, especially in America, where some of the other guests, TV and people, are some of my greatest idols of television from the '60s, or people like I get to meet the EC, all the EC people. I was a huge EC fan. I won't bother to explain what EC is, but you should know. And I eventually would meet them, and that would be fantastic. And some of them, like Sergio Aragonis, who is popular here in Europe, who visits. For years, he's treated me like, because he's a big Duck fan, a big Marx fan, and he treats me like his equal. And I grew up reading Sergio. So things like that are wonderful. Or being at conventions like in one in Spain and I think one in Portugal, where the guests of the convention were invited to have a private banquet with the mayor. And it was just like in a movie. We're in the presidential type palace, the mayoral palace, which is some palace from ancient times. And they had the food being served by liveried waiters who would bring the dishes in. One waiter would bring it in, and a different waiter would carry out the dirty dishes. And there's things like that. But the greatest moments are just constantly when I'm doing signings, exactly like this. I had several today. People come and they start telling me stories about their childhood and how my stories help them get through very difficult times in their life. Maybe one of their parents died or got divorced, or they had cancer and had to, and that is very humbling. Because I say, I just wanted to entertain you for 10 minutes. And actually, I didn't even want to do that. I just wanted to entertain myself. But the reason that comics were so important to me is I came from a dysfunctional family. The comics were my greatest comfort. And I hear from other people that the comics were important to them. And the guy just today was telling me that. He was a war refugee who moved to Denmark. And that his only joy was telling me how important my story. He'd go to the library every day and read my stories, and he started crying, telling me, and I said, "You got to stop crying because you're going to make me cry too." And I'm getting choked up now. So those are the moments that are the most magnificent, and I could never remember all of them. But that's why I will sit for 10 hours nonstop signing books for fans, because I so deeply appreciate what they tell me, and I worked this thankless job and low-paying job for an extra 20 years because of the appreciation of the Europeans. I never knew that there were Barks fans left in the world when I did that first story in 1987. That was a complete epiphany to me. And then find out that within months I'm the most popular writer and artist. When I went to work for Egmont in 1991, simply because they could see that I liked what I was doing. I was doing it for fun. I always explain it, readers would look and say, and think to themselves, for somebody to obviously put so much work into such bad art, he must be having a good time. And they can enjoy it because it looked like fan art. And they could see I was having fun. So those are the sorts of most special moments. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. I can't remember individually, and some of the mail I get is just really heartwarming and heartrending, and this makes me feel really nice. Well, but that's what Karl Marx did for people too.
Well, maybe we can make just 1 or 2 questions from the
I love to
audiences.
get questions from...
Yeah.
Any questions? Yeah, 1 or 2 questions.
Well, there we.
There's one, yeah.
Their rent expires on the hall in 15 minutes. So you have to get out.
What is your own favorite story?
I answer.
Your own favorite story.
Oh, not my story. The Karl Marx story.
Yeah.
That's what he means. When my sister moved away from home, she was 11 years older than I was. That's why I was exposed to comic books literally from birth. And she moved away about 1961, and I inherited all of her comics. She left them, so by rights of salvage, they became my property. But then, for the first time, I went to the store and pointed out the comic that I wanted my parents to buy me. And it was of course it was going to be a duck comic, but it was a Donald Duck comic long after Karl Marx had quit doing them. Anyway, I figured I'd outgrown these duck comics because I read this comic and it wasn't any good at all. So I must have outgrown them. So I started looking at the Superman comics, and those were lovely in the late 50s and early 60s. They had all the silly Lois Lane comics and Jimmy Olsen comics. It had nothing to do with violence. It was all what if. What if Superman turned into a giant ant, or crazy stuff like that, or if Jimmy Olsen grew 8 arms. But so I slowly got rid of all my sister's comics and traded them in 2 for 1 at the used paperback bookstore. We didn't have comic shops. We had used paperback bookstores that would have comics sitting on a big table in the middle of the room. You get them for 2 cents each, or you could trade in 2 old comics for 1 other old comic. So I traded all her comics in, and then but there were 2 that I couldn't get rid of because they were too wonderful. So I just hid them in a drawer because I knew this must be childish stuff, so I didn't want anybody to know I was saving these talking duck comics. And one was the Golden Helmet, Karl Marx classic Donald Duck adventure, I think his best Donald Duck adventure. But another one was I didn't know it at the time because I didn't pay any attention to numbers on the issues. I didn't even know there were, was a place in the issue has a date and a number. But it was the first issue of the American Uncle Scrooge comic. The big Donaldists in the audience will know that Barks created Scrooge as a background character. Wasn't particularly wealthy. He was just cheap. And then he used him 5 more times until the editors said, this is an interesting character, and we're going to give him his own quarterly comic for you to, and that'll be your main job, is writing and drawing adventure stories about Uncle Scrooge. So, and the other comic I kept was the first issue of Uncle Scrooge. I had no idea that's what it was, but it had lots of background, backstory, as you'd call it now. That's because this Barks apparently was proud of this creation, and he was giving him a whole backstory about the Yukon and about adventures, and then that really fascinated me. It was like an old movie. And it also had, at the ending, after the action sequence and everything, it started out with the backstory of Scrooge, and then there was a nice action. This was the one about the money lake, where Scrooge hid all of his money bin contents in a lake underwater, and the Beagle Boys tried to get it. But then at the end, there's 2 or 3 pages of just where Donald is telling Scrooge that despite all his money, he's only a poor old man. That was the story, the title of the story, Only a Poor Old Man. Not Duck, because Barks's characters were people. I always saw them as people when I was growing up. But this was very adult emotions in it. And this really appealed to me. This was like an old movie. And I kept that one. So I think that's my favorite Carl Barks story. And the first 4 or 5 issues of Uncle Scrooge comics, the title, were done on that level. He was doing more for an adult audience, like I did. I was working for an adult audience. I didn't care if kids read it. If they wanted to, that's okay. But I was working for another Barks fan like myself. But that was my favorite story, still is my favorite Uncle Scrooge story. Those 2, the Golden Helmet. Oh, but the editors, after about 4 issues, told him that the emotions and plot lines are a little too adult. And I was reading a book this last year, written by Michael Barrier, that he talks about. He was sorry. He thought he liked the stories, but they made him kind of dumb it down. And in those days, the publishers of comic books in America were really scared about the notoriety they were getting. So even Dell Comics, which are the best comics ever made, they were all the best drawn and the most sophisticated. Even they were scared when they really had no reason to be, but they told him to, put fewer emotions and, make them more like kids' comics. But those early issues of Uncle Scrooge are what really made it for me, and but that was my favorite, and that one and the Golden Helmet. But then I like lots of other comics, EC Comics, and like I say, I've got one of the biggest collections of comics in America, and I tell people that, oh yeah, all the Disney comics. No, all the comics. I've got an exhaustive collection of everything from World War II on. Everything. Virtually, except romance comics, those are for girls. And Archie comics, those are for girls. But I've got everything else. So that's enough. If we're going to get any more questions, but that's my... Time's up.
A last question? A very last question.
Make it good.
Okay.
Hurry.
All right. Which Nordic country is your favorite? And why is it probably Finland? I'm guessing.
Well, let's see if I can come up with a good answer to that. Denmark and Sweden are both have very similar fans, big duck fans, like all over Scandinavia. The differences, and just in the last year, I've done just about each Scandinavian country for a convention or a tour, plus Finland. I don't know if that's considered a Scandinavian country. I think not officially, but the Finns are the biggest duck fans of all. The difference is, for us, I have the most fun visiting with the Finnish fans. They're very shy and they're quiet, but they love Barks's ducks, and they seem to like my ducks. But they're not collectors, so I get to sign lots of books for them, but they won't buy any prints. And we have to sell prints. Primarily, I just love to come and visit duck fans, but in order to pay for it, and so my wife won't get mad at me, I have to bring home some money. But so the Finns are very dear, but they're not collectors. They don't buy original art, and they don't buy. But that doesn't bother me. Norwegians buy a lot. I've had, and I tell you things you should do. I do American shows still, just for fun, because I've been going to comic convention for 50 years, so I still do it in America. But whenever I'm on the East Coast, there's maybe up to a dozen Europeans will fly in just because they know they can, instead of waiting in line or queue for 7 hours to see me, they can just walk up and sit down, and I can sign as much stuff as they put in front of me and do them free drawings. Or make them my lovely assistant, whether they're men or women, just because I'm bored in America. It's lonely sitting at a comic convention. But I remember a Norwegian came when I was in Boston once, came up, and I would always give any Europeans who showed up free prints, because I really would wanted to pay my expenses by selling the prints to the Americans who thought they think this is DuckTales, or they think I did the voice of Donald Duck in cartoons. They have no idea who I am, but I'd sell prints to them. I'm serious. And I'd want to give them away to Norwegians, or I should say Europeans or South Americans. And a guy came from Norway, and I said, "Oh, but of course you get all the prints you want for free." And I said, "Which ones would you like?" And he said, "One of each." And I've got 90 prints, $20 a piece. And I don't want to make that kind of money in America. I just want to make enough to pay for the expenses of being there. But so I think we finally came in an arrangement of half price. That was still too much money. Made me feel really guilty. But he was a big husky guy, and I suspect, as I recall, he worked on oil rig. So they had, and the other Norwegians say the same thing. Said, "Don't worry about us. We're okay." But that's one difference. But I love visiting all countries. As nice as the fans are in Denmark, and I think Scandinavia has the biggest duck fans. But then there's countries where I've become popular in just like the last 10 or 15 years, like France and Italy. Now we're talking about very, very emotional people, and that's even more fun. To have people coming up and they're trembling, women are trembling, and they think that, and that's something that bothers me. They have this idea of celebrity, and that I've learned that that's all in people's minds. And I tell them that they're so trembling just to meet me, and I say, just relax. I mean, how could I be a celebrity in Europe and I'm nobody in America? It doesn't make sense. It's all in your head. And I remember times when women I was trying to make them relax, and I'm just holding their hand, and I kiss their hand, so they just relax, and they're gone. They're faint dead away. I remember in France once, a big tall guy he was the next in line. And his wife was talking to him, and I was dealing with one guy. I look up, and she's looking up at him, and he's crying, and he's just relax. This is so surreal. But yeah, it's fun to meet these very emotional fans. I guess you can appreciate that. I know that the Scandinavians are the bigger duck fans, but these are very emotional people. That's fine. it's all surreal. That's why I can't take it serious. Well, I do take it seriously, but I can only take it for about 2 or 3 weeks at the most, and then I have to go back home and see. Well, that was surreal.
Going back to being pretty much nobody.
Yes, exactly. My neighbors have no idea who I am.
Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Don. On behalf of Copenhagen Comics and all your fans, thanks a lot for coming here. Hope to see you back in Denmark soon. It's been great pleasure for us. And thanks for Leila for making a great moderator tonight. See you next year.